for the Apache, these plants were an important source of food and also allowed them to make fire and even to make lances for weaponry. So there's not many in the wild in my area, so I came to this area because they're a pretty common ornamental plant. But there are 3 species of Sotol in Texas, and that's the genus Dasylirion. All Sotols are found in the Southwest, and all species that there are in Texas. And there's one that's only in Texas, which is Dasylirion taxonomy, the species right here. And then it's a common element of the Southwest flora, such as yucca or agave or cacti. And it looks very similar to a big yucca at first glance, but it has sawtooth leaves, unlike the yucca. Now, if you look at yucca leaves very closely, they actually do have very fine serrations, but the marked sawteeth is diagnostic of this Dasylirion genus. So the Apache, both the Lipan, Mescalero, and Chiricahua, as well as the Tahnawautham and Mexican Kickapoo, all ate the hearts of Sotol, similar to the agave hearts that were eaten. But there was a little extra step in it. So the heart is basically the basal rosette. You can't see any part of it right now, but if you were to cut off all the leaves, it's kind of the part where it meets the ground and then it goes out to form all these leaves. Basically where all the leaves meet in the center there's some more thick flesh, consistency that's somewhat similar to this if it was wet, not dried up. So the leaves would be removed and those would be baked in an earth oven, just like agave hearts were cooked. But after baking, they were dried and then ground into a meal, formed into cakes, and those cakes were baked into ashes and then eaten. The cooked hearts were also sometimes fermented to make a beverage, but the flowering stalks were also eaten by the Apache, Mexican Kickapoo, and Tahnawautham. But you want to eat them when they're young and emerging. Now you want to eat the hearts just when the flowering stalk is emerging as well. So at the same time you have 2 different food sources. Now the flowering stalks of all yuccas and agaves that I know of are edible, and you eat them when they're emerging, when they're about this tall. They haven't really gotten outside of the length of the leaves of the plant. And at that stage, you can cook them and eat them. You can't eat them raw, but if you cook them, commonly putting them in the earth oven was done historically. They could also be charred over an open fire and the outer part just removed and the tender inner part, which is the part that you want really, was eaten. I've cooked different yucca species, their flowering stalks in the oven, but I like to wrap them in foil first or do something so they're not losing too much moisture. They have a taste that's very similar to asparagus, and all of these are actually in the Asparagaceae, or the asparagus family. And they kind of look like an asparagus as well when they're emerging. They look like a giant asparagus, I should say. But the flowering stalks also had a really great other use. Fire is the basis of all human culture. That's basically what made us human. And the flowering stalks of Sotol are by far the best material, personally, that I know of for making the friction fire drill. I read that the Apache were using the flowering stalk, dried flowering stalk, for both the hearthboard and the drill for the friction fire starting. And I had been trying a bunch of different wood species for friction fires, and I gave Sotol a try for both the hearthboard and the spindle and the friction fire, and it's amazing how much faster it was to create fire using the Sotol flowering stalk. But again, it has to be dried, and they only flower in the spring, and then these die away, and you can't really find them as commonly the rest of the year. But sometimes you can find the dried flowering stalks just hanging on at random times throughout the year. So it's nice because they're very thick, and so you get a lot of surface area with which to turn them, and surface area of the drill tip against the hearthboard. And they're very porous. They have a very low density, and so that's good for creating a high friction and chipping off, allowing it to char. You want the materials to grind together. and form an ember. So they're excellent material for the fire drill, but they're also very popular among both the Apache and Comanche for making lances. Now, the ones here, since they're planted, I don't know what's been going on, maybe genetic, maybe something environmental here, maybe the way, I don't know, but they're very bendy. Typically, like that one in the background, they're very straight, and they're about the perfect size for a lance. So 8 to 10 feet, maybe 12 feet, that was the desired length for a lance of a mounted Apache or Comanche warrior. If it's too long, it's gonna get in the way. But that would be their secondary weapon in addition to their bow. And it was the favored secondary weapon for sure. And one reason is because of that very low wood density. It's a very light material. So it's not gonna take much effort to move around. And it could also be easily replaced if broken, because Sotol's pretty common and you don't really have to do much processing to turn it into a lance. You simply have to add a lance head. Now sometimes they were simply sharpened and fire hardened. Fire hardening is just singeing it in the fire, charring it, and getting some coals in there and then rubbing it off. That tends to give any wood a lot more strength and durability. But more commonly, it was tipped with a lance head. In later years, that would be made out of metal. And so you'd have a long metal lance head, about 8 to 12 inches long, attached to this, hafted on with maybe some rawhide and pitch, and perhaps sinew. But historically also flint and stone lance heads were commonly used. Mounted with such Sotol lances, the Apache and Comanche absolutely dominated the armies of the Spanish, Mexican, and American countries for 400 years. The Tanawatem and Mexican Kickapoo also used the leaves of Sotol for basketry, and the Apache pounded up the leaves to make a sort of brush similar to yucca was also used.